Today on the Cameron Journal podcast, I am joined by Jack Moore. Now, we've had a little bit of a production issue here. I don't remember how we found Jack exactly, but he has come to us. He is here, and this was honestly the least of what happened today. There was a scheduling mishap on my part. He had to sit here for 5 minutes while I put my face on and change clothes, because I thought we had rebooked for Monday. It has been a disaster. This is behind the scenes of the Cameron Journal podcast. Things have gone wrong. But today's discussion should be pretty exciting because we're going to be talking about the various and sundry issues with the JFK assassination. Now, as those who pay attention to the news will know, President Trump has recently signed an executive order to release classified files on JFK, MLK, RFK, a bunch of assassinations and all this type of thing. Um, And obviously, RFK Son's going to tell us all how to eat better. So, this is in light of all that's happening and in light of the many years and many books that have been written on this conspiracy and grassy knolls and all this sort of thing, bouncing bullets and this sort of thing. We're going to dig into this a little bit today. I do want to mention that if you are into conspiracy theory sort of stuff, I do have an ongoing series at playingsip.org. It's fake news and conspiracy theory, how the conspiracy theory movement brought us fake news. And I talk about that because it's the granddaddy of all this stuff. It's where the CIA invented the term, was the reaction of people not believing the original Warren report. And so we're going to get into all that today. So welcome, Jack, to the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
You're very welcome. So, excellent. So why don't we begin from the beginning? Because I have so little information about you.
Sure.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into all this stuff?
Okay. I grew up in Bowling Green, Virginia. It's a tiny town, but it's right off of 95. People familiar with Virginia, kind of goes DC down to Richmond, turn down to the beach. It's 95 to 64. So I was off of 95 between Richmond and Fredericksburg and 70 miles from Washington, DC. So my father was in law enforcement. My mother was an avid reader. They just both passed away a few years ago, but they were 90 plus years old. So growing up, my mom cut out all the newspaper clippings from the assassination. I was a year and a half. She was 31. She voted for Nixon in 1960 and then told me years later, I kind of fell in love with Kennedy. And back then, as you know, a 1960 candidate, Kennedy Nixon, they're not that really far apart politically. The world was a different world then, but she began to grow to really respect and care about Kennedy. And I think she was very emotionally shaken by the death. So she cuts out all the newspapers and things. And this was at my thesis defense. It was kind of a weird moment. William Whitehurst, who will be 100 years old here in a few weeks or in March, was in Congress for 18 years. I got my master's at Old Dominion University in Norfolk, Virginia. And at a point in my defense, he's like, "So, Jack, tell us when you got interested in this." And I'm like, well, I'm kind of embarrassed to say my father was in the Army Reserve. He was a captain on his way to getting his promotion to major and had a snafu coming out of the Army Reserve and spoke to our U.S. representative from our district, Herb Bateman. And he said, "Go up and talk to this person at the Pentagon." So on this particular day, I'm in the back seat of the car. And I hear my mom talking about the book, The Day Kennedy Was Shot by Jim Bishop, which was published in 1967. And then she mentions we ought to go over to Arlington while we're up here and see the grave site, which has now been open to the public. I know both were 1967. So I'm in that 5 to 6 range. So I'm one of those weird kids that is already really, as a young kid, interested in the assassination. And given the time frame, most everything out there is conspiratorial. It's all attacks on the Warren Commission. So as I go through the years and I'm early 90s completing my master's thesis or my master's degree, I go to my thesis advisor and said, I want to write on the Kennedy assassination. What's available? There happened to be a professor on campus from Arizona State. He told me about an article in the Stanford Law Review from 1967 where a gentleman named Kaplan had written that to that point, there had been 4 stages of literature. All things written before the Warren Commission as a first stage of literature. The Warren Commission itself as a second stage. The third stage was all the books and articles in criticism of the Warren Commission. And then the fourth was signaled with Life magazine coming out and saying, we need a new investigation. So my thesis, I picked it up from that point. and worked forward through 1993 when I finished my thesis on what had been written. And as you know, with Watergate and then Frank Church and the Rockefeller Commission and the Church hearings, there was a known to the public there was really a lot of stuff in the mid 70s. We're coming out of Vietnam, we're coming out of Watergate, and the Church committee's finding out that the mob had been enlisted by the CIA to take out Castro, something that Alan Dulles had said on the Warren Commission and told no one. I mean, he's sitting there, he knows that that's a potential blowback that Kennedy might have been taking. He doesn't say anything. So there's all these agencies. Then the Hosty note, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Oswald supposedly days before the assassination goes into the FBI headquarters in Dallas and leaves a note saying, if you keep harassing my wife, I'm going to blow up the building. After Oswald's killed, Gordon Shanklin, the director of that office, tells Hosty to destroy the note. That's not known till the mid-70s. And then the other big thing that happens mid-70s is Geraldo Rivera puts the Zapruder film on national TV. And now everybody sees the backward movement of the head, all hell's breaking loose, and it leads to the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the late 70s. The next big thing, as you know, is the JFK movie in 1991, Oliver Stone, which led to this congressional board that said all files shall be released by 2017. And now here we are at 2025. And President Trump in his second term says, that's it, I'm pulling the lid off. And now we're going to find out whatever we find out. But that's really my background growing up in Virginia. I went to law school. I'm an attorney. And I will say from doing criminal work, both as a prosecutor and a defense attorney, and I know I'm rambling here a little bit at the opening, but there's a lot I have to say about eyewitness testimony and what's come down through the years. And you've probably had other attorneys to say eyewitness testimony is pretty much absolutely useless. There's very little credibility you can give to eyewitness testimony.
No, I was talking with my buddy the other night, and we were talking about the unreliability of eyewitness testimony, and I said, yeah, that's why prosecutors tend not to want to bring circumstantial cases forward, because it's far too easy for the defense to take apart witnesses, and then what do you have? They like scientific evidence, they like other stuff, that kind of brings it all together, sort of thing. I'm glad you mentioned the mob. We're going to dive right into the deep end of the pool. I discovered and have written somewhat extensively, and I don't know if you know about this, the mysterious death of television personality Dorothy Kilgallen.
Quite familiar.
Yes. And so for the listener, very quickly, Dorothy Kilgallen was kind of the Oprah of her day. She had a syndicated national radio show that was very popular, morning television. She was on a very old TV show we don't have anymore called What's My Line? Mm-hmm. And it would be a panel of celebrities, and they would guess different people's professions, including celebrities. Mm-hmm. And on the night of her last appearance on that show, she was meeting a contact in New York because she had gone down to New Orleans and had discovered a trove of documentation about the mob involvement in the Kennedy assassination. Now, she's discovered this in 1964. It's fresh on the country's mind at the time. And obviously, if she starts reporting on it, everyone would have been talking about it. Mysteriously, she never makes that meeting. Her husband and her friends find her passed out from sleeping pills in a guest bedroom of her New York home. And everyone's immediately suspicious because, one, she didn't take sleeping pills, didn't have a prescription for those pills, but her name was on the bottle. And two, she had gone to bed in not her bedroom. She'd gone to bed in a guest room that was used for friends and family sort of thing. And the documentation that multiple people knew she had was long gone. They searched the house from rafter to cellar. And that was the first time when I came across a guy who'd written a book about it, and I knew Dorothy Kilgallen because I love old television. I always joke, I watch a lot of TV of people who are dead. And so I'm like, oh, Dorothy, I had no idea. And I didn't necessarily know I knew she was on that show. I didn't know how famous she was. Yeah. So then I started digging into the background of Dorothy Kilgallen. And it's kind of funny because of all the talk about the JFK conspiracy, very rarely does the mob connection come up a lot. The CIA connection comes up a lot, but very rarely does the mob connection come up. And I think that's partly because there was an interested party in making sure that that information never did come out. And I think the lack and dearth of information, the fact that Dorothy Kilgallen never got a report out, is one of the reasons why the organized crime angle was able to fly under the radar. Thoughts?
I remember something too, correct me, because you know your stuff on this, on the Kilgallen. Wasn't it also like her reading glasses weren't with her? She's in the bed with the book, not her bed, but a guest room, like you said. It was something about her eyeglasses are all the way across the room or something, yet she's supposed to be reading in bed. I think that was...
Yes.
There was a bunch of strange circles. I'm with you on that.
All of her husband and friends who discovered the body were like, none of this looks right. She's in the wrong room. She doesn't take signals. Her glasses are over there, but she's everything. And her husband knew that she had gone to New Orleans and had compiled this info and was ready to break the whole thing open. And they're like, and these very important documents are gone.
Now, I know that Garrison is going to push. My thought, if I remember correctly, she had gone to Dallas to interview Ruby.
Yes, she had.
Right. And that I thought that, there was some friends that came out later. My memory of this coverage of Kilgallen was friends were saying, oh, I got a bombshell Monday morning. I'm coming out with it. I've been down to Ruby. Ruby's got all kinds of neat things to tell me. And then boom, she's gone.
No, yeah, she had told people this is coming out. I figured all this. I mean, she had started to tell people and it started to circulate that she was coming out with something. Also, an interesting thing that the guy who wrote this book had discovered is that the whoever she was supposed to meet, it was a last minute thing because the show What's My Line aired on Sunday nights, and it was fashionable at that time to wear long gowns and formal wear on television, and she had dressed in this long gown. She got a call about this contact. She changed clothes. She changed into more of a day wear, streetwear thing, wore that on television because she was going to leave from Rockefeller Center. It was NBC. She was going to leave from Rockefeller Center and immediately go meet this contact. So she wouldn't have to change. And so the idea goes is that whoever that contact was probably the person that killed her so they could steal the documents and make sure the story would never come out. Because that would have been an even bigger story if they'd left her alive. She'd come out and say, I had all the stuff and let me tell you what got stolen. That would have been a scandal of its own. It was all under very suspicious, odd circumstances how it all went down. And the story goes, based upon what she told friends, was she had found the mob connection between the mafia out of New Orleans and the Kennedy assassination. But because the documents are gone, there was never any proof, and therefore, and honestly, the story kind of died with her because you look at the stuff later and everyone's focused on Oswald's Soviet connection because he'd been in the Soviet Union. Everyone's focused on the CIA because of Cuba and a bunch of other issues, and Kennedy was not a fan of the huge CIA. He'd stopped them from killing Charles de Gaulle by warning the French, and that had pissed off people in Langley, all this sort of thing. And I feel like, I don't know if this is your view, I feel like the mob connection has really flown under the radar in the whole JFK conspiracy world.
Well, all right, let me back out and say this about the whole thing where I started. Again, when I started as a teenager, I was only hearing one side of it. I'd never read the Warren Commission other than parts of the report, the 888 page report, or the condensed version that the Associated Press put out. I mean, nobody really went through the 26 volumes. I mean, people just didn't really do that. So I went with a lot of Mark Lane, and I'm hearing Robert Groden, and this is long before I see JFK, but I know all of that. Let me say this about all of that. I think there is some important lanes to basically draw. And Gary Hart, I wrote this in my thesis, made a really, I think, interesting comment, the senator. He said—
From Colorado.
Yes, exactly.
I'm originally from Colorado.
They got in trouble with Donna Rice, right? But anyway, so Gary Hart said,
"There's with his campaign manager that's so low rent now."
Especially, right. But especially after saying, "Hey, press, I live a boring life. Come watch me," and they did. But anyway, Senator Hart made this comment. He said, "There's two things really going on with the assassination. There's the how it happened, and there's the who done it." Another thing in his story, and I heard say, which I think is even more important, because this is how I felt. When I finished my thesis, that William Whitehurst from Congress, he goes, "Jack, I want you to publish this. I want it in the New Yorker magazine." But hey, one thing bothered me at the end. He's an establishment guy. And I said, what's that? He goes, you hedged your bets at the end. You had Oswald doing it then. You said you're not sure. And I'm like, I'm not. I'm not sure he didn't involve himself with someone else. But the point that I heard this historian make is there's two major churches, and they are churches of extreme faith when it comes to the assassination. He goes, there's a Church of the Grand Conspiracy, and its high priest was Mark Lane, followed later by, Oliver Stone. And no matter how small a detail, if it's slightly unexplainable, it means grand conspiracy. He goes, but there's also the Church of the Lone Nut. And it was Vincent Bugliosi and Gerald Posner with Case Closed. No matter what, Oswald acted alone. And he said, what is left that a lot of people don't really get into is, what if Oswald did it, but he was dirty? He's involved with something. And that's what's been the cover up. And let me say this too about where I ended up. In 1994, I just finished my thesis. I have a friend of mine.
I'm in the third denomination because I think Dorothy Kilgallen figured it out.
Well, and you may be right. And you may be right. But let me just say, I will say, or let me just say this up front. I'm absolutely convinced Oswald fired all the shots, and that's all the shots that were fired. I don't have any doubt that Oswald was the shooter. When I've been to Dealey Plaza 20 times probably. The first time I go, and anyone that goes there kind of says this, they get there and they're like, holy cow, that's the distance. Once you get to the window, it's 88 yards to headshot.
Right.
When you talk to people with military backgrounds, first time I went down with my father, who had a very extensive military background in the Army. And, we were down there. He's in his early 60s. I'm like, what do you think, Dad? And he goes, it's an easy shot. That's it. Yeah. I mean, I'm really shocked to see the distance. So anyway, it's
a lot smaller than people imagine.
Right. But I'm not convinced. So getting back into that third church of Oswald did it. 1994, I'm in Dealey Plaza. And I've taken a friend. We've driven down to Dallas from Virginia. We went to Atlanta, to New Orleans, out to Dallas. She's an athletic trainer. I was a coach. I drop her off. And I'm like, I'm going to go play in Dealey Plaza while you're at this convention all day. And this guy comes down, running down the hill in a suit. And he goes, hey, what do you think happened? I'm like, well, I'm one of those crazy people think that Oswald did it. He goes, come with me. So we go on the hill. There's a guy out there's got the apron and the money changer and magazines. He's selling magazines. He's talking 14 shooters from 14 locations. So we kind of argue with him. We pull aside and the guy says, hey, man, you really know your stuff. And I said, well, I just wrote a master's thesis. I'm like, you too, what's your story? And he goes, I'm from Northern Virginia. And I'm like, I'm from Virginia. And he goes, well, my daddy's somebody. And I'm like, okay. And I said, meaning? And he said, well, when the House Select Committee on Assassinations was set up, he made some phone calls and he got me in as a page. So then he says at that moment, what are you doing tomorrow? I'm like, what do you want to do? And he goes, let's go around and check everything out. So we go to the 1026 North Beckley Avenue where Oswald had the rooming house. We go to the Neely Street address. We pull in the backyard right where the stairs are, where the backyard photograph was taken. We go to Jefferson where he's arrested. We go everywhere. We go down to where he was shot at the Dallas City Jail. So we go to all these different places. And then when we finish up that evening, we go out with my other friend out to dinner. And he said, what are you doing tomorrow? And I said, nothing special. He goes, can you do me a favor? He's an American Airlines pilot. He said, can you drive me over to the airport, save me taxi? I was like, sure. So I drive him over. He's got an American Airlines garment bag. I guess he's a pilot. I pull up to a door that says American Airline personnel. He's getting out of the car. And I lean over the seat as he's getting out. And I'm like, hey, brother, I might not ever see you again. And I haven't. And I said, look, you say you were on the inside. You saw the House Select Committee. Tell me what I'm not going to learn for 50 years. And he leaned back into the car and he goes, hey, I saw it all. Oswald did it. Trouble is who he did it for. That's exactly what he said. And I was left with that 30 plus years ago. And he looked right at me and he said, believe me, the shooting was one shooter. It's him. But he had dirty connections to U.S. intelligence. And that's what they're covering up. And I'm like, how many 19-year-old Marines take off and go to the Soviet Union? There's a lot of interest. And I know you know all these facts. There's a lot of interesting facts about how he got out of out of the Marine Corps with a dire need discharge because mommy's sick. And then he goes straight to Europe and then on to the Soviet Union. It's a really strange story. But I do believe that I kind of backed out of it and said, okay, let me clear the shooting part first. And once I got to the point where I really got a lot of the information on what I think supports the single bullet theory, I'm like, okay, if that works, and I believe it does, and this guy does take off from the school book depository, does go back to a rooming house and get a pistol, shoots Tippett, which I know is highly disputed, but what he did do in the Texas theater is pull the weapon and try to shoot another cop. And there was a wrestling match to get the weapon away from him. That appears to be the type of behavior of one who's trying to get away. Now, he also had just under $200 to his name. He leaves $174 on the morning of the assassination with his wife at Ruth Payne's house. He leaves himself about $14. He spends $1 on the cab ride from downtown Dallas into North Beckley Avenue, then stays on foot. I have a friend of mine, got a PhD from UVA in foreign affairs, really bright guy, gets into the assassination. He goes, Jack, I did a bunch of research. I said, what'd you find out? He said the amount of money to get to the Mexican border via bus was in the range of what Oswald had on it. And he goes, so I believe he also, of course, left his wedding band with Marina, his wife. So he's a man in the morning of the assassination that leaves his wedding band, leaves her the bulk of the cash he has left to his name, leaves with $14, $15. And I know $1 was spent on that and on the cab ride. And he appears to be on the run. Now, I've taught this course in colleges before. And, one thing I always ask the students, why a theater? And, they come up with different answers. It's dark. It's off the street. It gets him off the street. He's being seen, or he could have potentially been seen, and there was a description going out. Now, saying all that, saying everything I just said, while I believe that about Oswald, I don't think that it's outside of the realm of possibility that he was involved with something. I did interview G. Robert Blakey when I finished my thesis, who was the chief counsel to the House Select Committee. And, he wrote a book where his whole angle was the mob. And the mob thing goes back to Joseph Kennedy was clearly mob connected up and down, the bootleg and all the rest. And so the argument was they got him the votes from Giacomo in Chicago that they needed to secure Illinois. And they did dirty things in West Virginia through the Electoral College in favor of Kennedy. And that the mob's view, there was a book called Double Cross. It was written by one of Giacomo's, I think it was his grandson. And it was written about, the Double Cross title was Kennedy won in large part because of mob support. And that was the understanding. Yes. And then Bobby turns around as the attorney general and attacks the mob. Yeah. So, and when you go down to Marcello in New Orleans and you go to Trafficani in Tampa, you got all the players that clearly want Kennedy out.
Right.
And they had lost their casinos in Cuba, so they had reason to want to go back into Cuba. Right. And again, we know for a fact that the CIA was enlisting the mob to try to take Castro out. And it's known by the Kennedy administration. So I know I'm kind of going all around here, but
no. The one thing I wanted to circle back to, speaking of the shooting, and it's not that distance. Dealey Plaza is quite small. The one thing that kind of always bothered me about that was the bullet problem, and I wanted to get your view of that in terms of
a single bullet.
Yes, how the bullet reaches all the destinations it has to, given velocity and a bunch of math that we're not going to go into at this juncture.
Well, I think it's for me, it's this. When I'm finishing my thesis, and it's up here on the shelf somewhere, I'll never be able to pull it and find it. But someone published the actual, from the movie, the entire script of the movie in a book that's annotated with facts and figures and all these kind of footnotes within the actual script of the movie.
Right.
And in the back of this publication is a lot of articles throughout the years that were written regarding the whole dispute. And one of them I found was a guy after JFK, the movie, had come out that said, I was a UCLA physician, trained UCLA. I was called in to be part of the team to examine the single bullet theory. And he said, I'm going to be straight up. I wanted to get famous, disprove it, be on all the news shows, because there was one problem. Once I got in and actually saw the facts, I'm like, that's the only conclusion. So here's where reading that and looking at these factors, I have seen two studies where they take the weapon and fire the 6.5 millimeter ammunition from that Carcano rifle, Italian bolt action rifle. And in one study I saw, they fired into a pine log. They x-ray it, they drill down in, they pull it apart, and 36 inches in, the bullet is completely pristine. The other I saw, it penetrated 43 inches of pine board. Now, in 2013, there were two gentlemen that are ballistics experts that were called in on the 50th anniversary to discuss this. And they said even the FBI had difficulty early on with the ballistics and all the examination because it's a metal jacketed military round that they just don't generally see on the street. So I think it was the Geneva Convention of 1922 following World War I, where they said, for more humane reasons, let's begin to jacket the bullets in combat so that they don't mushroom with soft lead the way that they do and, go in small and take out somebody's back. And if you wound and don't kill, you tie up soldiers, moving them out. So there's all kinds of reasons in combat, as crazy as that seems, to have a convention to make combat nicer, but they come out with metal jacketed bullets, which commonly on the street and shooting crimes are not used. So the bullet did, according to these guys, exactly what it was supposed to do, penetrate soft tissue. Now, the next thing that really put me over the top on this is the fact that Connolly's wound to his back, it's in the clothing. And G. Robert Blakey said he met with Connolly in the late 70s and asked him to take his shirt off. And he says he has this wound in his back that now having healed is about 2-inch scar. The bullet was 1.25 inches long. The entry wound in his back is not neat and circular. It is of a bullet yaw or tumbling. So you have to ask yourself, what did it go through first to make it tumble? The next key thing for me was in 1993, there's a group out of Seattle called Failure Analysis. And they were doing a mock-up trial for the American Bar Association. And they were doing computer work to both prove the single bullet theory and disprove it. So what they did was they took two models. Kennedy was 6 feet 1/2 inch, and Connolly was 6 feet 3 inches tall. And they took two models and they worked them through every position that you could clearly see on the Zapruder film. And I think everyone's aware the Zapruder film is 486 frames. The shooting starts sometime after frame 160. So they go through each movement of the two men, then feed that information into a computer to see what the angles would have been created. In doing so, these people discovered something that no one had ever yet noticed. And that's that at frame 224, the Zapruder film, Connolly's lapel literally jumps off of his chest. What's happening at the exact same time? Kennedy's arms are coming up. He's not grabbing his throat. His fists are balled. His arms are coming up. Some say it's a neuromuscular reaction to a bullet that is crossed very close to his spinal column. It's an involuntary reaction. But when he reacts, it's the exact same time that Connolly's chest, the lapel is flying forward, which should indicate that's when the bullet's passing. Now, he in the 60s, Connolly, looked at Life magazine, and they did a whole 1967 or so. He's looking at, no, I'm hit much further. It's not the same bullet. He's assuming, based upon what he believes is his reaction on the Zapruder film, that is reacting like 238, 240, which doesn't allow enough time for the recycling of the bolt-action rifle to have fired another shot. But regardless of what Connolly believed, thought in his heart, the bottom line is the lapel is flying forward at the exact same time. So that one other thing too, I saw recently on a newscast, they said group of people, some scientist types at some university say they've disproven the single bullet theory. And then when you hear the guy actually do his take up on it, he goes, here's the problem, the single bullet theory. Connolly needed to be lower and to the left. That's exactly where he was. Another thing people don't recognize until they see the inside of this 1961 Lincoln is the jump seat is literally in the floor of the car. And the back seat could be raised as much as 10 inches. Now, I'm not saying it was in that position, but if you see some of the shots, and they were included in the Warren Commission exhibits, when you see the relative height of the back seat and the jump seat, you can see how much higher Kennedy is. And the jump seat comes out from underneath of the front seat where it's much more inboard. So as you can tell in the film, Kennedy has his arm hanging over the ledge of the car door. And
Right.
Connally is much more to the center. And Connally is also turning to his right, as he stated in the Warren Commission testimony, which perfectly aligns him for the bullet to enter the way it did. So
I think yes. No, I think there's also on this topic, and honestly, what a time for the governor of Texas to be shot. That would have been a story, except for the president got killed behind you. The other aspect is the seeming failure and the people who made the decision the president should travel in an open car in Dallas that day. Now, to set the scene, it's 1963. They're getting ready for a contentious reelection in 1964, and the polling was not great. People that's been forgotten, but Kennedy's popularity was going down. The polling was not great, and they were trying to shore up the South, which still voted Democrat at that time. They're trying to shore up the South. That's why they were down there to begin with.
All true.
And so you have there's some I've always found it interesting, and someone had mentioned the guy's name at one point, and I've forgotten who it was. But at some point, there's a decision that it's best for the president to travel in an open-topped car.
He did it all the time.
I mean, I know it was common back then, but that always has struck me as odd why they would make that decision on that day in particular.
Well, everything I know, it was his decision. It was always, let me see the public when possible. Now, as you probably know, it rained the night before. They came into Fort Worth. They spent the night. They get up the next day. They go to a breakfast. Then they jump, I think it's called Caldwell Air Force Base. It's a 13-minute flight from Fort Worth to Dallas. And the reason they could have driven it, really, I mean, Fort Worth to Dallas is not that great a distance, but they want to do the dramatic. When they fly, President goes out first. Johnson goes out second. He overtakes him, lands first, so he can be there to shake Kennedy's hand when he gets off the plane. So they do the big landing at Love Field, 11:38-ish, I think. It's almost about an hour before the assassination. He goes to the fence and presses flesh. He's over there shaking hands. That's far more dangerous. They don't know who the hell's behind the fence. It's 5,000 people that showed up at Love Field. Someone with a handgun could have easily taken him out there. And the Secret Service is, of course, left with, like, Mr. President, like, get your ass in the car, let's go. And he's over there waving at people and shaking hands. So the morning of, it's dreary, overcast. Then all of a sudden the sun pops out, the temperature jumps into the mid-60s, and then the decision's made. Everything I've ever heard was Kennedy wanted the top down. The top that they had with that 61 Lincoln was modified like plexiglass. It wasn't bulletproof or resistant. It was just for the weather. So even if now it could have deflected a shot, if he'd gone through and carried through with the bubble top on, maybe Oswald, whoever, doesn't take a shot. But that could have happened. But with the weather change, they went to, I want everyone to see me. Everything I read now, there is a lot of books that have said that the Secret Service was sinister in this, and I think they're just like a lot of government agencies. They're very inept. I just think that they are, and I think they get used to many
never
days.
Confuse stupidity for maliciousness.
Right now, it is true. A number of the Secret Service agents the night before were out drinking till 4 a.m. and they may not have reacted so well the next day. It's in the Warren Commission. Earl Warren was quite upset with the director of the Secret Service because he's like, what kind of disciplinary action are you going to take with these Secret Service agents that spent the night drinking? Well, they feel real bad about what happened. Sounds very similar to what we heard last summer. It's kind of like, hey, we at the Secret Service feel really bad about what happened. We're not going to really grind our people too much about it because it was a bad day. And I'm not saying that had anything to do with what ends up going down. Now, I have seen a lot of motorcycle formations, other cities, other security details, which would make you think they weren't in it that day real hard. They weren't doing their best job they've ever done. And I think the reaction, other than Clint Hill, wasn't great. I'm not a Secret Service agent. I haven't sworn an oath to throw myself in front of the president. But the Algens photograph, which is from the southern side of the infill there at Dealey Plaza shows the two agents on the running board on Kennedy's side looking over their shoulder, which would indicate the shot came from above and behind. Hill's looking at Kennedy. Hill springs into action. The others really don't move off the car.
Right.
And it is Greer has a strange reaction, but in retrospect, maybe not. There are people that believe he slapped on the brakes. It's in some of the films, it's not really clear, but I think in one of the Knicks or much more films.
Well, there's the infamous front end dip. That's where the brake thing comes from. Because obviously this is a huge car. It weighed 6,500 pounds, I think, something like that.
That's right.
It was the 60s. And so it's you don't stop those cars on a dime, not by any stretch of the imagination. And there's you see kind of the front end dip, which people think was a braking action, and then it raises back up visibly, which was common at cars at the time, raises back up visibly as they speed away, sort of thing. Yeah. And I'm not. I mean, that could have been. I kind of fault that to panic. I think the human reaction, despite training, when something like that has happened and there's a Secret Service agent crawling up the back of a trunk lid, with the modest assistance of Jackie Kennedy sort of thing, to kind of maybe have that, shit, stop moment, and then, oh crap, we got to get out of here sort of thing. Yeah. And given, drum brakes and car suspension of the day, that would account for that sort of thing. I don't necessarily think that was the conspiracy end of it. I'm glad we had this conversation, because I always wondered if there was something there with the decision around traveling in an open-topped car, which, retrospectively seems unwise, but and certainly isn't done now.
One other thing about what you just said about the limo driver too is I don't know in, Garden Variety, M1A1, 1963, Secret Service training, what they were being taught. But there might also be the thing, you have a triple underpass, or you have that overpass over the highway of the underpass where the railroad is. Yeah. I don't know that the first thing that goes through Greer's mind is, oh, hell, I might be riding into an ambush. Like the shooting started, if I press the gas, they're going to drop bombs on us from above. Grenade. I mean, who the hell knows what he's thinking, or he thinks he might be driving into it. But I agree with you. I think a human reaction is to kind of go to the brake. Now, Greer clearly also turns and looks directly back in the seat. And that has led to, in some very grainy, bad editions of the Zapruder film, makes people believe that the shining on the top of Roy Kellerman's head, the other Secret Service agent, is a handgun, and that Greer's just point blank turning around and shooting Kennedy in the head. I have a lot of friends every day like, hey, what about the driver shot him? I'm like, I don't really think the driver shot him. If you look at clearer versions of it, Greer's hands are on the wheel. They're not on a handgun. But he does turn. And you ask, I don't know, you ask yourself, you're kind of like, is that really the proper reaction? Now, Rufus Youngblood in the car with Lyndon Johnson immediately knocks him to the floorboard and lays on it. Yeah. Roy Kellerman in the front seat with Kennedy is kind of ducking. He's getting on the radio and he's ducking down and shots are being fired. So other than Hill coming in, like you say, from the other vehicle and jumping on the back, there isn't a lot of real positive reaction by the Secret Service agents in the car. Right. And now I know one thing I always wondered too, and I actually saw it in the movie about Jackie Kennedy, the Natalie Portman one. God, it's almost been 10 years now. But they addressed how she sat with Theodore White, the writer, and talked openly about, as a matter of fact, they said after the assassination, she would just go into tears and tell anybody about the gory details of the shooting. That was a thing with her. But I always wondered, there's clear on the Zapruder film shot, his reaction, her grabbing his arm with her gloved hand, and sort of a quizzical, like, what's going on? What's going on? Headshot, his head explodes, and then it's panic. And I think a lot of his backward head snap is the fact that if you look closely, she pushes, which I think is an absolutely natural reaction. If you have your hands on someone and their head explodes in your face, you might push away. So I think some of him going back. But my point is, I wondered if she always grieved over when he was hit, why didn't she just pull him down? But she didn't. And she says that to Theodore White. When she sat with him, she said, the one thing I can't get over and I can't get out of my mind is, why did I just pull him down? but she's sort of holding him up like, what's the matter? What's the matter? Until the headshot. Now, with the corset he wore, there was no going down the seat. He could have gone down sideways, but going forward was an impossibility.
Right. Of course, because of his ongoing back and spine issues.
There was a lot of stuff with his health. Yes, it was definitely being covered up. Yeah.
Yeah. It's no, that's a whole I that definitely makes a lot of sense. No, that's all very interesting. Yeah, I always kind of wondered if there was a there, and there's not quite a there. But it's there's so many. I mean, obviously, this is one of the most analyzed, written about, talked about moments in American history, sort of thing.
No question.
And a lot of ink has been spilled, books written, I've seen, now with technology, I have seen AI enabled 4K upcycle versions of the Zapruder film, and people, are looking for the tiniest motions and details because now it's so much clearer that AI can kind of fill in the bits and get rid of some of the noise and all this sort of thing. Kind of as a big meta issue sort of thing, and then we got to close because we're at the hour. Why do you think this in particular has garnered this type of attention?
Why do I think the Kennedy assassination in general?
Yeah, because these things are not necessarily uncommon. Someone went after Jerry Ford, Reagan twice. Obviously, Trump is running for president last summer. Even in the 19th century, obviously Abraham Lincoln, McKinley, and I'm missing one somewhere.
Garfield was killed in 1901.
Yeah, so that's the one I'm missing. Yes,
right.
This isn't necessarily an uncommon thing, but of all the incidences that have happened in 248 years of this country, this one stands out, and this is the one that kind of sticks in everybody's craw. Why do you think that is?
I think that we as humans, culturally, and just as a aspect of our very nature, we sort of project from the individual out to communities and larger senses, etc. And we tend to put a family type of feel to things. There's a narrative going on. And I believe coming out of World War II, there was somewhat of a downslide with Korea because we're supposed to win all the wars. We're the good guys. Pearl Harbor happens, and now, we go off to Europe and the Pacific and we win the war and we're the good guys and all of this type of thing. So I think that, and then the Eisenhower years are sort of the happy days, from the television series. And there is kind of an oversimplified vision that I've heard that that's when the 50s ended. That's when the innocence ended. And I remember seeing on like the 25th.
My mother has mentioned that.
Yeah, I think
my mother was 7 years old, and her memory of that day very clearly is she said, we were in school. They brought in a television to watch the news report, which was not done in 1963.
Right.
And she said every single teacher was crying in the hallways.
Sure.
And she grew up in a tiny school in eastern Colorado. I don't think had they moved to Texas yet? I don't think they've moved to Texas yet. And sort of thing. And that was my mother, that was kind of her thought about it all. And then just, they went home from school early, which was unheard of. They let the children out of the school. And, and grandma at that time, Uncle Del had just been born, so she was picking up the other 3 children with baby in tow. He was only 7 months old at that time. And, and she was crying in the car, waiting to pick up the children from school, sort of thing. So that my mother would totally be with you on that. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I remember seeing on the 25th anniversary, and bless her heart, I see this woman being interviewed. I'm watching a woman being interviewed in 1988, 25th anniversary. And she, at that point, 25 years older than when it happened. And they said, hey, how's the Kennedy assassination affect you? She burst into tears and she goes, my life's just never been right since, And I'm thinking, a person who's very, very, very separated from you, a person that might be the chief executive, etc., but she's crying as if she'd lost her closest family friend. And all you have to see is the films of the people lined up for miles to get into the Capitol Rotunda to see the casket there, it was a very shocking thing. I do think the fact he was a very photogenic man, along with the beautiful wife and little kids, little John saluting, his father. That was heartbreaking stuff. And I think it did here's a guy who said, let's go to the moon. Let's look forward. The world's a nasty place, followed by not long after, Malcolm X is killed, which is much more a regional thing. I mean, he was a national figure, but you know what I'm saying? Like, he was a New York figure. But then when it's King, and then when it's Bobby Kennedy, and then when we're escalating the war in Vietnam, I remember as a kid watching Vietnam plastered on TV every night. All these kids getting pulled into helicopters, shot up, bandages, blood everywhere. And I'm like, hey, my grandparents went to World War II. My dad got drafted during Korea. Now there's going to be some war I'm going to get called into. That's kind of what we do. So all this innocence has been moved. And I think Watergate had a lot to do with it as well. I think that's 10 years later. But I think the people start to go, wait a minute. They're lying to us about everything. And I thought the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, when you find out that basically the whole escalation of the Vietnam War is based upon a lie.
Right.
But last thing on all this.
No, I've written
Ruby
about
getting
this
shot. Ruby getting shot was the big thing. I mean, I'm not Ruby. Ruby killing Oswald. That's what I think really set everything off. But
no,
I think,
when it comes to the distrust of media and government, there's polling that shows the Kennedy assassination was a beginning of a downward trend. Watergate about killed it. My mom and I have had this conversation, and she goes through a very similar thing of being like, well, there was the Kennedy assassination. Then we had all that problems in Vietnam. Yeah. And then for her, she puts in Kent State there. And then there was the Kent State thing. And then there was Watergate, and so because by the time Watergate happens, my mom's in high school because my mom's 69 this year. So she's in high school by the time Watergate happens, sort of thing. And it's like, and that about did it, especially for people of her age, of her vintage, all this type of thing. And that I've written about that sort of progression of, that's, and honestly, and when it comes to, we in the media, we have never recovered from that stuff. I think our trust in government, we know via polling, has never recovered from this stuff.
That's true.
Even among those of us who were born, in some cases, decades after this stuff occurred. It is interesting that, that all of this has happened. I think the only other one that compares in terms of the ink spilled is the Lincoln assassination, because it comes at the end of the Civil War by an aggrieved Confederate, sort of thing.
And it was a conspiracy.
It was. That one actually was a conspiracy. Yeah. That one, it really, yes, it really was. It absolutely really was. Whereas a lot of the other ones were, Garfield was just a nut job, a nut job sort of thing. McKinley was a nut job sort of thing. The Teddy Roosevelt shooting, because he didn't die, he just kept giving another hour and a half speech.
Exactly.
Sort of thing, was a nut job sort of thing. But no, it only really was a conspiracy, and there were, people paid off and things put in place to make the Lincoln assassination possible and all this sort of thing. But one of the things that I've also kind of found a bit odd about the Kennedy assassination, and this kind of lends to the conspiracy idea, is how convenient to have the vice president and the chief justice of the Supreme Court just standing by, ready to go at a moment's notice. A lot of people would look to that and say, well, that's not at all suspicious. How often does one...
Commission? You mean with the Warren Commission?
No, I mean the events of the day with LBJ getting sworn in on the plane. Why?
Well, that was actually.
Do they regularly travel with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court? Why on earth?
No, that was Sarah Hughes. She was a district judge in Texas. That wasn't the Chief Justice.
Oh, well, see, I've got my facts wrong. And thank you for clarifying.
Okay. That's okay. No, but what's funny is she had actually just been appointed by Kennedy, nominated and declared the Senate. And Kennedy wasn't really hot on her one way or the other, but it was an old family friend. Now, that's a little bit interesting because when it goes down, he's like, well, call Sarah, because she's sitting in a district courthouse, federal courthouse in the state of Texas. Just recently, she had been made a federal judge. And then she jumps in the car and drives over. But and technically, it wasn't necessary. Everybody takes the oath on January 20th, 61. He takes the oath as well. The moment Kennedy's dead, he's president. I think he did it to rub the nose. Well, he said he did it for the world. I'm going to show some strength, and here at the airport, say who's boss. Now he calls Bobby Kennedy and asks for the actual wording of the oath, which really pisses off Bobby Kennedy. His brother's dead, and Johnson's calling like, "Hey, Bobby, I know it's kind of tough time for the family, but can you get those words together before the oath?" And he's like, "What are you doing? Why are you taking the oath there?" "Well, I want to show the world that I'm president." He's kicking all the Kennedy people off the plane.
Which is unnecessary because of the Security Act of 1947, but whatever.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. That's I always, I mean, that always I always found that the way he acted, all that sort of thing. I mean, I know when he was there, he was from Texas. They were trying to build political support in Texas. That all checks out. That makes sense. But I always thought his actions in the immediate aftermath, as you just mentioned, that was all a bit odd.
Well, there is a point that apparently there was a huge fight between Johnson and the Kennedy people about Connally being in the car with Kennedy. Now, I don't know what that means, but it was like, hey, you're not putting John there, my best friend, because they were best friends. And I don't know what Connally knows or doesn't know. There is a tape, though, of Johnson in the days following the assassination. And I don't know. I've said this on another show. I don't know if he's trying to put something out to have a cover story. But he's on the phone with J. Edgar Hoover, and he goes, "What do you got, J. Edgar?" And he goes, "It's this Oswald cat. He's crazy. We've looked at everything." And then Johnson says, "Well, you don't think he was trying to hit me too, do you?" And then J. Edgar Hoover's like, no. It was just he was after Kennedy. Now, if he sincerely meant that, that would be an indication he would. Now, that was one of these recorded phone calls that he recorded everything. If that were true, if he was truly asking, "You think I was a target too?" that would imply he had nothing to do with it because he would know that he wasn't. Then again, he might have had the foresight to say, "I'm going to ask J. Edgar if he thought I was a target. So if anybody, hey, hell, I was afraid I was part of, targeted." And there's another whole conspiracy that it was Connally that Oswald was after over his discharge from the Marine Corps. Because Connally had been the Secretary of the Navy until 1962 when he ran for governor. And there's no doubt that Oswald wrote Connally as the Secretary of the Navy because they had downgraded his discharge from honorable to undesirable. It was like something between that and dishonorable. Yeah. And he had asked for help. And what the Connally people did was like, I don't even know what the hell this is about. They put a bumper sticker, "Vote for Connally for governor," and sent it back to him. So instead of responding to him and his request for help with his discharge, they just sent him a bumper sticker. And that was supposed to have incensed Oswald. And there's a whole book written by a guy that said, he was shooting at Connally. Kennedy just got in the way. You happened to hit Kennedy in the back of the head trying to shoot Connally. And then you're kind of like, that's kind of a weird time to shoot at Connally. Was the day that the president.
There was so many. There were so many better, easier, faster opportunities to do that. Which I think is interesting. But I mean, maybe that, and also I think Oswald would not have known that Connally would have been in the front seat of that car that day.
I agree.
And again, with the governor, it's like you can just hang out in Austin and like find him in the loo. Like many easier ways.
And Connally
no need to hang out in book depositories. Like,
well, Connally spoke to it in his lifetime because somebody came to him and said, "There's a whole rumor out." It was really early on. There's a whole rumor out. You may have. He goes, "Hell no! You could have picked up me anytime. You could have come to Austin and killed me anytime if you want to." The security detail with Kennedy would have been much greater. It makes no sense for him to pick that day. I mean, that's a bit. Well, we've gone over time, and I don't want to keep you ever because we could go on. I mean, we could keep going. This could be 2 hours. So let's not go that crazy. So why don't you tell us where we can keep up with you online and find you on social media and keep up with your work? What I'm doing right now is I'm doing a podcast called More, Moore, to Consider. And I'm just trying to do a show where I discuss events, some historical like this. And I'm really into football, baseball, anything sports related, but kind of history, movies, sort of the whole American pop culture. I mean, that's when you said Kilgallen. I'm like, I'm right with you, brother. I totally get that. And I go watch all the old black and white. What's my line? That's great TV. Actually, it was much better TV.
I enjoy a lot of those old shows and things. I watch all sorts of. One of my favorite shows ever is Dynasty, which literally went off the air when I was 3 years old, but it's my favorite show. Like it's anytime there's a channel on Pluto, which is this online streaming service. They have a whole channel, and I'll just put it on in the background and vacuum the house. So it's
Well, I'd love to
So-
do this again together. Maybe we'll get together on another subject sometime because I really enjoyed it and I appreciate this time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, this was absolutely fun and delightful. I don't think ever in the history of this show of 5 years we've ever kind of gone in on deep on this sort of thing. But I love it because, like I said, I'm doing this series right now about conspiracy theory and fake news for planksip.org. So it dovetails perfectly into new editions of that. So, well, thank you. So what's the name of your podcast one more time?
More to Consider. MOORE to Consider.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on the Cameron Journal podcast.
Thank you, sir.
That's all for this episode of the Cameron Journal podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Visit us online at CameronJournal.com. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and I love to talk to my followers and listeners, so please feel free to get us on social media at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, and we'll see you next time on the Cameron Journal podcast.